All right, today we are interviewing Jean Pons, who's been a longtime Pleasanton resident. I'm Rebecca Bruner on the board at the museum, and this is Jean. And he's going to tell us his story and how his family got to California.
Well, yes, and then a little bit, moving on a little bit
Yes.
on that.
Yes. So tell us first, how long have you lived in Pleasanton?
I've lived in Pleasanton, well, I was born and raised, I was born about 100 yards from here. My mother was born about 100 yards from here with the help of, what did they call them at that time?
Midwife?
Midwife, yeah. I ended up not having to be born with a midwife. I went to Livermore and there was a little hospital there, 4 rooms, that's it. And that's where I was born.
4 room, the whole hospital was 4
The whole
rooms.
hospital had 4 rooms.
Wow.
Okay. And so that was the start. You want to know about my grandfather?
Yeah, but where did you live 100 yards from here?
Okay, we lived in the back, it's the bicycle shop that's right here.
Okay, on Main Street.
Okay, and my grandfather had the Colombo Hotel that later was passed on to my dad, and there was a little house back there. We lived back there, and the property was the Colombo Hotel, rooms upstairs, a bar saloon downstairs, a restaurant, and there were several little living units in the back. And then in the front on the street, there was a French bakery that my dad leased the property to. And then, let's see, what was next to that was a barber shop.
Okay, so the Colombo Hotel fronted Main Street or not?
Yes.
It fronted.
Yeah.
So where was it in conjunction, what would be in its place today?
Well, it is the bicycle shop.
Okay.
And then there's a couple little boutiques next to it. In the back, there's a home, a little home, and then there was there was about 6 or 7 small like motel rooms, and they're still there, and they've been updated and so forth. They're rental units. And
Yes.
So forth.
Yeah.
So that's what it consisted. There was a big round area in the back at one time. It was called a beer garden, where you could come out and serve beer and food and so forth. So that was where I started.
Okay. Well, your grandfather started this hotel.
Yeah.
And where did your grandfather come from?
My grandfather came in 1896 to California, and he was over in the peninsula, and then he walked from the peninsula around where San Jose is and came here, and was here in the summer of 1897, and found a fellow Italian, and they went into truck gardening business here. He comes from Chiavari, which is on the coast of Italy, about 15 minutes from Cinque Terre. I don't know if you've heard of Cinque Terre. It's
I have,
beautiful area there, and so forth. So he came, and he started a truck garden and so forth. But he was an immigrant, and immigrants weren't looked on too well at that time. He was Italian, and he couldn't get much funding, but he and my uncles that all had come here ran into a guy named Giannini. And Giannini formed the Bank of Italy and loaned money to Italians.
Oh.
Bank of Italy turned into Bank of America, which ended up as one of the biggest banks in the world at one time, and certainly a big bank in this country.
Yes.
So he loaned him money, and at the turn of the century, he was approached by the city elders and said, would you like to buy a hotel and restaurant and bar and so forth? And he said, I don't know much about that. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, Pleasanton, as you know, was full of bars, had like, what, 19 bars in it, and that many brothels. And they said, we'll loan you interest-free, but you got to get rid of the girls upstairs.
Okay, so the Colombo Hotel was already in existence.
Yeah, it was called something else, and then he
Okay.
named it.
And
so,
it did have some women who worked
and
there.
they had, yes. And so he did that. But now he had been here about 5 or 6 years, and he was betrothed to a woman girl in Italy, and he sent a letter to her saying, I'm all settled now, so you can come, we get married. And she writes back, she said, I got married 3 years ago. I was waiting, this is 6 years have gone by. So he writes to her, and he says, well, you have a sister, don't you? And Adele, and she was much younger. He really didn't know. And so he wrote back and said, yes, we have Adele. And she's not married. He says, well, send her over. I'll marry her. Okay. So she got on a boat in Genoa, came into Ellis Island with a note on her saying, put this woman on a train, transcontinental to Pleasanton. And so they did. And he had a horse and buggy. He met her here. It was the Central Pacific Railroad. And he just waited. She came in about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he picked her up, and they went to St. Augustine and got married. And that's how he started. He needed a cook for the restaurant. So
he married the cook.
And
I hope she could cook well.
she was a great cook, yeah. And so that's how he got started. Owned the restaurant and bar and so forth through Prohibition. He was a bootlegger. We had a still. And everybody,
In the basement?
And everybody did. No, we had a little winery. Later on, I moved there. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. But it's the little Vervis Avenue that's there. And there was a little winery there. And so we made wine and distilled the wine, made grappa, and during Prohibition, everybody in town served alcohol.
Served up front, or did you have to buy it out the back door, or do you know how?
Well, if you had a restaurant, you served dinners, and you want a cup of coffee, you got coffee with a jolt of 120 proof grappa, and that's it. So I asked him one time, I said, now how did you get away with all this? And he said, the little envelope under the table, as they used to call it. And everybody the guys that came out and inspected and so forth. And that was until 1932, and things changed. And a new district attorney came in, and that changed the whole thing. So
In which way?
Yeah, and he was. Let's see, that was the first governor of California. That was. Let's see, who was the first governor there? Trying to think. Anyway, he ended up being governor of California and also the head of the Supreme Court and in the U.S. Supreme Court. He was a straight arrow kind of guy.
So what did he do with the drinking?
Well, the Prohibition only lasted about a year more, and they just, my grandfather at that time really wasn't running the operation. He had leased it out, and it was very complicated and so forth, and so they said, well, they shut him down for a year. That was about it. Then my Prohibition was over, and then my dad took over the place and so forth. So that's kind of that story.
Yeah, interesting though, how
Yeah.
that they just would tape envelopes under the table and.
So, well, it was kind of like passing
just
it.
kind of
It
passing
was a term that was used in Italy when it was Earl Warren, now I think
Yes,
about it,
yeah.
the name comes back, who took over as district attorney. I have all the paperwork on it, signed by him,
Oh, okay.
about, you're in violation of the Prohibition Act and so forth.
So they actually shut Grandpa down,
They shut the business down.
but they
Yes.
didn't take him to jail?
Oh, no. That's,
Okay.
about that time, everybody accepted the fact that Prohibition was going to end. It was pretty ridiculous.
Okay.
Too many people liked their alcohol. They weren't going to do it.
And so, but were other people shut down too?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And he just changed the whole thing. Very honest, very straightforward guy, was governor of California and ended up as head of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, he had a great reputation.
The Warren Commission that did
Yeah.
the studies on Kennedy's assassination and so forth. He was a great guy. So, and those were the kind of the Prohibition years and so forth, and then Prohibition was over. And, the stock market crashed in 1929. So you had the stock market crash and you had Prohibition, and the single biggest source of income in this country was the tax on alcohol. So things really changed. So the Depression started with the crash in 1929, and the stock market went down, until about 1931, 32, that rock bottom. And the government was dead broke, no welfare, no social services types of things, no support. So.
And what year were you born?
I was born 1935 at the rock bottom of the, of the Depression. And so my dad was working at Castlewood, the country club, and that went bankrupt. And so my grandfather gave up the operation of the Columba Hotel and so forth, and my dad took it over because he had no job. And so he ran that, my mother and him did, and I was born in 1935. And then it was just trying to make a living, and then what happened with Prohibition, which harmed us here, is we were a very good wine growing area here. I mean, there was nothing but wineries all over the area. And we were pretty competitive and so forth. But when Prohibition came by, we had to shut everything down. A lot of the vineyards were turned into something else and so forth. But in Napa, in those areas, they made wine for the church. So they had got an opportunity to kind of exist. And while we kind of were shutting down our whole industry. So we started to try to get things going back again. Now, I don't know if you heard about the Fiesta del Vino. Did you know anything about that?
No, tell me about that.
Okay. In trying to do all this, we got Lodi and all the wineries that were trying to come back again and to start a wine industry in the area. And the Fiesta del Vino was, my dad and 5 other persons in town put this together. I have a lot of photographs about it. People don't know about it. We had a big parade with all the wineries coming in and so forth, and we're trying to put all this thing together. And it was kind of rolling up, and then the war broke out, and all of that kind of went by the wayside, and then I call them the warriors came at that point.
Now, Phil, when you talk about this Fiesta, was it just 1 year, or was it an ongoing thing over a couple of years?
It was, I believe, a couple of years, but the big year when they put it together, they had a really big parade. I've got great photographs of the whole thing. The whole town dressed up in early American.
Oh, neat, yeah.
Everybody, all the businesses and so forth. And it was quite successful. And they had the queen of the fiesta and so forth. And so we were kind of coming out of this at this point, and then when
Then the war
broke out, everything changed totally, and those were the war years. Up until that time, from the depths of the Depression to there were we lived rather humbly, I should say. I mean, we hunted a lot. There's a whole stories about the hunting in the valley, the deer and rabbits and everything else. People lived off of.
Were there turkeys here then?
No
Okay.
turkeys, but a lot of deer and so forth. Mm-hmm. And we had big vegetable gardens. I lived. There was a time when the war broke out, and my dad had to go to work for Kaiser and so forth to get into war work, and so we lived with my grandparents. So my grandfather, my mother, father, and I lived in a small house on the end of town on Vervis Avenue and so forth.
But what happened with the hotel?
The hotel my dad sold.
Okay.
So, and it was untimely because when the base, military base started up out here, all the sailors came in, and the person that took it over made an awful lot of money, but that's another story. But there was a whole era there where there was no support service or anything. You lived on your own. So,
yes.
So essentially we had this huge garden. We had chickens. We had eggs. There was a woman, Mrs. Medeiros, that I would go in my bicycle about every 2 days and get milk. She would milk the cow and strain it through cheesecloth, and I would bring it home, and my grandmother would make butter and cheese. And then we had all the hunting and so forth. I should have brought the thing that I had that showed the whole family lined up after a hunt with all of the animals.
Oh, with all the animals.
And so forth and so forth. I had it all lined up, but I never got back to really picking it all up. It was what we used as an advertisement when Phil and I did that presentation.
Oh.
Because that was Pleasanton then versus Pleasanton now.
No.
But we lived on $28 a month.
Okay. And Phil, when you're talking about, Jean, when you're talking about, yes, you and Phil have done a number of presentations on Pleasanton and growing up here.
Right.
Yeah, it's just for the audience so that,
Right,
they
yeah.
understand. But who was living in Pleasanton at the time the war started? What was the population made of?
The population essentially was made of various types of immigrants. It was a big Italian contingent here,
Okay.
Germans. Probably one of the biggest was the Portuguese that came from the Azores.
Why did they come here?
At the end of the 1800s, Europe was in a terrific economic problem, and making a living and living was very, very difficult. The United States was an area of opportunity, and all these people came in. Most of the Portuguese came from the Azores. My grandfather and grandmother came from Italy. People came from Germany here. And so
How about Mexicans? How about
and
Chinese?
Mexicans and so forth. Now, in my family, my dad had 4 sisters, 3 brothers, and then the sisters marry in. But in my family, we had Greeks that were here. I had 2 uncles that were Greek. And there was Portuguese, French. My grandfather came from France and came here in 1904. And my mother married one of my sons, so I'm half French and half Italian.
Okay.
In fact, I didn't speak English until I was about 5 years old. I spoke Italian because
That's what you spoke at home.
yeah.
And you could get around okay in Pleasanton just speaking Italian.
Yeah, well, I was on, when I went to school then
You
very
had
quickly.
to.
And my mother the same way. She spoke mostly Italian when she was born.
Okay.
And learned very quickly when she went to school.
Weren't there a lot of Dutch people here as well?
They were people from Denmark and Sweden because we had all the dairies and we needed the milkers because they didn't have automatic milking machines then.
Okay.
And in fact, when my grandfather got rid of the girls upstairs, that's who lived here. The milkers lived in some of the rentals around here, and then they were also staying. They were boarders. He actually had boarders.
Okay.
That they would feed in the morning before they went out and worked, and they worked in the fields around here that were growing various kinds of things and so forth.
Okay.
So it was a agricultural community made up of migrants, essentially. That's what it was.
Oh, and I asked about Mexicans. Were there Mexicans
I
in the
forgot
mix as well?
Mexicans. My cousin, Larry Mesa, is Mexican.
Okay.
Yeah, Larry's my cousin.
Okay.
So, he worked for the school district. I don't know if you know him or not.
No, I know his name.
Yeah. And so it was Mexican. So look at all the, and when we got together, all of these people brought their own food and their own culture. I can remember doing Greek dances when we got together. So, look at the cross section of people.
Yes.
And the whole community was that way. I would say that we were probably almost had more diversity in the community than we ever had before, and maybe even now. It was,
And how did that work? How did that work, that you had all these different people from different cultures, different languages, and...
I think it worked really well. And we were so used to having all this diversity among us so that we all really it was accepted.
okay.
Actually, the Portuguese at one time were almost dominant, and a lot of the religion and religious festivities was around, like the Holy Ghost. I don't know if you ever...
Yes, I've heard about those festivals.
And that was mostly Portuguese. And so, especially, we got together a lot in big numbers for like Sunday dinners and so forth. And here were all this we had Greek food, we had Mexican food, we had, French, Italian. It was a cross section.
Yeah, and your family certainly was accepting because you said all these aunts married.
Oh yeah, they all married each other and so forth.
Yeah,
There was also, as growing up in here, a feeling of great security. You just felt like you were part of this big group, and they always looked after you, one way or the other. If you did something not too good, everybody really knew about it.
Yeah.
And the police, I remember when I was a kid, got pulled over a couple times because you're not supposed to have loud pipes on your car, and then they'd say, your dad wouldn't like that. You take those things off, they were. But the whole community was, we were kind of isolated out here. It was just Livermore, Pleasanton, and nothing else.
Not much in Dublin until war.
Nothing. And Danville was just a place that you...
San Ramon?
San Ramon, but they had the church and a cemetery and actually it was a stopover from a stagecoach that was coming from San Jose, Mission San Jose, coming through to go to Sacramento. Okay. That's all it was. There was nothing there. Two-lane road, and that was about it.
Okay.
So, not much going on here. Not a big population. The racetrack was a big thing. a racetrack goes clear back to what, 1860 and so forth, and happened to be a stopover here, and then this area developed.
It was a big, in that it brought a lot of people when the races were on, or how was it big? The racetrack, yeah.
The racetrack had a reputation for the great earth that was there for horse racing and so forth.
Okay.
And of course you had all the barns and the training areas and so forth there. So there was quite a big community there.
Okay.
You know, people that bought horses, raced them, had them raised there, had them trained there. And then we had the fair. And the Alameda County Fair was there, so we had a lot of people coming in. The first time I went to the fair, I was 3 years old, and I'm 88, and I've never missed going to a fair.
All these years?
All these years, yeah, I've gone there every
Wow.
time. And the first one I went to, there was, all it was the sale of farm machinery and so forth. That was about it. And and there was nothing else there. The only thing I remember there was you paid 10 cents and you saw a two-headed cow. That's the only thing. No,
And it was a dead one in a jar?
no, it was a real
one. Oh,
I remember
wow.
walking around it and looking at it. It looked horrible. I had both of these heads and with his eyes watering and everything. It was horrible looking, but there was nothing there, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, and I remember Shell how so was somehow represented, and the Shell emblem on a little handle, and you fanned yourself because it was really, you know, very hot and so forth. There was nothing, and then. You know, it just grew up and so forth. So, you know, it was a rough little town. And I did the things with Phil and I, what it was like, we called it bandits, brothels, and bar rooms.
Yeah.
And that was rough time.
Rough, but you felt very secure in that
Yeah.
you knew so many of the people. But I know you'd mentioned rough goings on, especially with the bars. And then when the war came.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a sleepy little town, and we're struggling to pull ourselves back together out of the Great Recession, and then came the war years. And the war years were really interesting because the United States did not want to get into the war. And as you know, the war, Hitler had expanded, had gone into Poland, Austria, France, and so forth, and Mussolini was going into North Africa to get all the petroleum, and the Japanese Imperial Army and Navy were expanding, took over China and so forth. And even though all of that expanded and so forth, we had signed the armistice and we did not want to get into the war. At the time the war broke out, 80% of the people said we don't want to get in the war. But we knew that how things were going, and Britain was having a terrible time, and they were on the brink of losing. And if you think about it, we were totally surrounded. It was Canada and us, and if this thing kept going, you know, we were ultimately would be in it, but we didn't prepare for it. So it was like we were turning our head around on it, not facing the truth, not preparing for the war and so forth. But the war was expanding and coming about us, and we were just hanging there by ourselves.
And Jean, for a lot of the people, I mean, you said, you know, an uncle just came from France, you know, in the late 1800s or early 1900s. So a lot of these people had recently come and probably had a lot of family back in these countries.
All of them had family.
Yeah. And so, but yet they still didn't want to get into the war.
Right. Mussolini had taken over Italy,
Yeah.
and the Italians here were very fearful about it because Mussolini was getting with Hitler, and he was a fascist, and there was a lot of fascist activity that went on, and we were fearful of the relatives that were in Italy, and it was saying, and then my grandfather in France. Of course, France, that was
Did you see more people come over at that time? Were people able to get out of these countries and come to be with families, or?
I had a cousin that came from Italy during this time, and then they said if you wanted to become a citizen, you can join the army, and we'll automatically make you a citizen. Well, he did, and he ended up dying on Omaha Beach, and so there was those kinds of things. But the people here were very patriotic and were very concerned about what was going on. There was communications that was going on back and forth between the relatives here and there up until a certain point. Then there wasn't, and there was nothing but worry about it. Then they couldn't get out. Then they couldn't come here, and so forth. You know, so.
So how did the war impact your family? Did members of your family have to go to war?
Yeah, and or get in war work.
Okay.
I'll tell you an interesting story. In November of 1941, my parents had the restaurant here, and it was traditional that when you entered into the main area of the bar and the diner and all the rest of that, they had a big Christmas tree. Okay. And so my mother had gone to Oakland, I think Capels was a place then, and bought a bunch of decorations for the tree. And she came home, and I love my parents, and they got along great. That's the first thing I ever remember about them having a disagreement. My mother came in, this is late November, to decorate the tree, and she bought all of these decorations, the bulbs, and they're made in Japan. So she gets home, and I can remember the scene, and my dad said, "What do you have there?" And she said, "Well, I've got ornaments for the tree." He says, "They're made in Japan." And he says, "Don't you know that we're going to go to war with you?" Now, the war hadn't broken out.
Right.
But people knew that. And he says, "They're going to be our enemy, and you just bought all this stuff for our enemy." And he picked all this stuff up, and he brought it out and threw it in a garbage can. And he was really upset because he says, "They're going to attack us."
Yeah. How could you be
But
spending money buying
the
their
point
things?
was, we weren't getting into the war, and yet the populace knew that it was inevitable, right?
Okay. With Japan as well as with Germany, or?
Well, Germany had already, we were almost, because we weren't that well connected, we were mostly involved with the war with Japan, the Pacific and everything, and all the military people left from this area to go work in the Pacific.
Yeah.
And the other was more Germany, and because that's where they were close and where their submarines were sinking ships and all the rest of that. So that was more our concern, is what goes on with Japan, and Japan was going to attack us. So Pearl Harbor was very dramatic to us, and also very scary, really scary, because the Japanese fleet attacked and destroyed Pearl Harbor, and the question was, were they going to continue coming here? And we know that we were defenseless.
Yeah.
And so soon as that happened, it was kind of traumatic, because they established air raid wardens, and we put up stuff so that blinders on the windows and so forth, blackouts and so forth. And trying to prepare in the event that the fleet came here. The first thing that I was aware of is that there was a lot of Japanese that were also, I should mention, that was part of, in my class that I was in, I think it was the 6th grade. And they were truck farmers out there where Sonoma Country Club, if you remember that whole area there. And I remember people coming in and removing all the Japanese.
Like one day just coming in the classroom.
Bingo, and they were out of that. And what they were afraid of, and I don't know whether it was true or not, but they were afraid of the contacts between the Japanese here and the attack. So they actually had, I guess, some submarines out there sending signals in and so forth. And the Japanese were trying to find out how well our defense systems were here, and we had absolutely none. There was a fear. Now, whether this really occurred or not, but they weren't taking any chances. We were so vulnerable.
Right. So
what they did is they just took them out and put them. But they also did it with some Italians also. I mean, in certain areas.
And I heard some Germans as well.
And Germans as well. And so, because of the fear. And so at the very...
And how, do you feel it was justified?
Was it justified?
At the time with the fear and...
Justified only in the sense that we were so vulnerable. It was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, that we had not mobilized at least a bit. I think the only gun and implements that we had were some Civil War cannons that you loaded from there was there's a fortress that you can go and visit. But it's Civil War kind of,
Are you talking about the headlands in San Francisco? Yeah.
So what happened is they formed these areas in Pleasanton. They were, I forgot what they were called. They had names for the guys that had the little helmet on, and they went around and made sure that everything was all screened off so that if airplanes flew over, they wouldn't be able to see and all the rest of that stuff. So then my Aunt Jafetta had a home here in town, and our section of town was asked to have all the males bring whatever armament they had to her home. There were these various meetings, and how well we were armed. And so we had a meeting over my aunt's house, and my cousin Jack and my cousin Loretta and we were just 6 or 7 years old. I remember, well, I was 7, sitting on the floor, and my dad and his uncles and everything came in. She had a big table. My dad put his rifle down there and how much ammunition he had, and all of them, and they were all laid out on the table. And this guy counted all of it, how many rounds of ammunition and the guns and so forth. And I was they didn't protect the kids or anything at all, like, we're going to have some kind of trauma,
You were just there.
You're there, and you're going to hear, this is what's going on, so, and we were wide-eyed watching this as they counted up the ammunition and the guns and so forth. And the purpose of this, if there was an invasion and we're not defended, they would have a resistance movement in the Livermore Hills. And it would be like a guerrilla operation, and they would stay there in order, it's like, this is crazy.
So they talked about doing all this in the Livermore Hills because they felt that was the best defensive
And we all
place.
hunted in the Livermore Hills, so we know where there are places to hide and so forth. It sounds ridiculous, but the fear of being totally defenseless and having that, really it was a huge mistake on the part of the Japanese. They could have kept here because of in Vallejo, those were the boat works and so forth.
Right.
And the naval the shipyards, and they were making submarines and everything. That could have destroyed that. I mean, it was we just didn't mobilize in time and so forth. So there was a lot of fear. So then very quickly we turned into a country that, the movie Tora, 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 one of the comments said from the Japanese is we've awakened a sleeping giant because we mobilized so fast. Women all went to work, Rosie the Riveter,
Right.
Over in the shipyards and so forth. My dad went to work for Kaiser, and we didn't have enough steel to do a lot of things, and so Kaiser was making boats out of concrete as trial, but it didn't work out very well. But if you didn't have enough steel and so forth, then you could put reinforced concrete and you could make the hulls of ships and so forth like that. A lot of experiments. Shipyards just came up like that. The mobilization was absolutely unbelievable at that time. And we had victory gardens, and we...
Now, were those shared with other people, or everybody had their own victory garden?
Everybody had their own victory gardens, but we always won the competition for the best victory garden. So you shared it with somebody else. In fact, relatives would come from San Francisco, and we would give them our produce and so forth. And so we were very self-sufficient. We had chickens, and so you got eggs, and we did a lot of hunting, whether it was in season or not.
Okay. And that was okay.
And that was okay. Rabbit, pheasant, quail, dove, venison. I was 9 years old, and my grandmother would say, "I need a rabbit to make the gravy." I grab a gun.
At 9 years old, and then you go out and shoot a rabbit.
Well, I could drive down the middle of Pleasanton on my bicycle with a shotgun on it, and nobody would think anything about. The difference then between now is unbelievable. About and everybody was together doing things and so forth, and so we survived very, very well. We had the winery there, and a little vineyard, and came along very good. My dad worked hard. Sometimes they worked 7 days a week, because Kaiser was making all the materials for landing bases in the islands and so forth like this. The first part of...
And is that why the CBs were in Dublin, is because Kaiser was making the landing?
Now, the first part of it of the war was very dramatic. The very first person killed was Ambrose Regalia, and that was up in the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese were there because the Japanese were all over. We were literally, it was Canada and us. This, you had to finally realize what all this was about. And so I still have the radio. And in fact, when Roosevelt made the statement that this day will live in infamy, and we weren't there, I was listening on the radio with my grandparents. And I have that radio. Because every night we would listen to this, and the first part of the war was terrible. The Bataan Death March, the MacArthur losing in the Philippines and saying, "I'll be back." The Japanese overtaking, those islands that we never heard of, Anahuac, Kwajalein, Midway, Iwo Jima, and so forth. We never knew anything about it, except that's where the Japanese were going to come, and then they could go from there to come here. So they wanted those islands and so forth. And we were losing them. We were losing the war. The war wasn't going good any place. It was kind of scary.
Yeah.
It really was scary. And then you went to church, And the priest would say, you know, here's who's missing in action, here's, let's say, the prayers for him and so forth. And
Did you hear pretty quickly if someone was missing in action or
Yeah.
someone had
Yeah.
died? Okay.
Ambrose, immediately.
Okay.
That was my grandmother's best friend. Her son was the one that was killed. And then Tony Cavestri, they announced he was missing in action over France, was shot down. And we all prayed for him and everything. This was kind of in the beginning. When the war was over, he came back. He was hidden for all those years by the French underground and moved from place to place to place. So my wife and I, on the anniversary, we went to Omaha Beach and landing leases and did all that. But the people in France sent him enough money to bring him there, and so he stayed there for a couple of weeks and so forth. And there were signs all over welcoming Americans and so forth, because so much went on in France after the war, and we lost so many people and so forth. So the first couple of years are really tough, because it was like, we're not gaining ground here, the Battle of the Bulge and so forth. And then we started really mobilizing. I mean, we really, this country really converted everything into wartime.
What were your parents saying to you? Or what were you thinking as a child? Do you remember? Were you like about the war? I mean, were you afraid?
At the beginning, we were afraid because we were so vulnerable.
Right.
But then the feeling was, this is a huge country and we can mobilize. We did everything we could. My mother used to take, when she fried or cooked or anything, put it in a can and bring it to the butcher. He would give her some food stamps for it because they used it in munitions. We collected all this stuff and turned in all the salvaged metal and everything. We collected all that, and people picked it all up. Everybody contributed to it. And
so you felt with that people had a better, more of a hopeful feeling?
Yes, we started feeling that we had the ability to convert over to a total wartime thing. You could only drive 45 miles an hour, and you can only get so much petroleum based upon the stamps you got. That was okay. I mean, that was all going for
people just accept it.
Yeah, we accepted everything that had to be done for the war effort, and everything was a war effort. Women worked in the shipyards. We collected all kinds of stuff to send in for it. We helped it was Camp Shoemaker then, and it was a naval base, and you did everything you could to help the sailors that were coming here, trained, and then they would go into the Pacific. And so you had to, I'm trying to think of the name of it. We did it in the Veterans Building. The women would go there and they would bring coffee and drinks and so forth, and they had music, and the girls would dance with the sailors.
Weren't they called donut dollies?
Yes, right. And there was just everything we could do was all turned on to that. And we didn't have, we had a 37 Ford, and that was it until 1950, because everything was converted over to making military vehicles and stuff like that. So that was kind of the war years, totally dedicated to all that. And then when we saw the war turn, and the biggest memory I have about that is, what was my mother? I guess I was 11 years old. We had gone to Walnut Creek to shop. There was nothing around here, you went shopping, you had to go some other place. It was just a little town. And we were driving back, And we were on the road there, just about the Danville, just a little 2-lane road. And all of a sudden, we saw all these cars lined up all along the road. And they were honking their horns and people getting out of cars. They were crying. They were hugging each other. And everything came to a stop. And we got out of the car and I said, well, you know, what's going on? And they said, the war's over.
Wow.
Japanese surrendered. And that was, you know, that was a big thing. And then,
How old were you when?
let's see, 35, 45, I was 11, I guess 11 years old.
But it had a big impact on you to see all these cars and all this celebration.
Yeah, they were all lined up on a single road and everybody stopped. See, we didn't have any radios in the car. The 37 Ford was, you know, and because everything went to manufacturing, I think we stopped manufacturing in 41, and we didn't start again until, I guess, 46. So you used, that's the other thing, you used everything you had. You were not going to get anything new at all for all
So
those
like
years.
not a new toaster, not a new coffee
Nothing,
pot?
because
Okay.
Food and Machinery, FMC, made tanks and so forth, and all the air lines and everything all made, you know, B-24s and 22s or whatever it is. And then everything else went to making military gear and explosives and all the rest of that. Totally. I mean, everything that you could produce anything with went to the war.
Yeah.
And so you lived with what you had, and that was it. And you repaired it, and you repaired it, and you repaired it.
And you had repairmen who would repair things as well?
Pardon?
Did you have repairmen who would repair things?
Actually, we were our own repairmen. My dad could repair anything, absolutely anything. And I learned a lot off of him.
Yeah.
About that. We were all pretty self-sufficient and so forth. And there wasn't a lot of men around. You remember, you know, a lot of people just went away to war. So it was those that didn't qualify, then were doing war work. So, I mean, you know, you had to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
You know, you did your own plumbing, you did your own this, you know, did your own that. It made us very self-sufficient, even from the first, let's say, the later years of the Great Depression, and then going into the war. It was a different type of, you know, compared to now, where there's so many services and there's so much things that you can do, and you can, you know, get a cup of coffee. All you have to do is go down to Starbucks, and all the rest of this, you just.
And now we've become such a throwaway society. We used to, I guess after the war, then some of these repair shops opened that repaired TVs and radios, and you could take your toaster and all that. And now those are pretty much dead and gone. Yeah, we just throw things away and buy new.
Yeah, we did also. My grandmother, she was from Italy, came from a very poor family up in the mountains. And she could repair the rags that she had, she could repair the rags. I mean, you know, and our clothes and everything was, you know, we used things up, and my mother patched everything you could think of and so forth. And but we had a feeling of self-sufficiency that made us very strong. You know, you had a different feeling about what you were. I mean, you were self-sufficient. You could handle things and so forth.
Do you feel we have that today?
No. I think that's one of the big, huge differences. And I have that feeling. Later on, and I worked my way through college, and I ended up at the lab, and I was business manager, and I had a lot of responsibility, like 705 employees under my operation, plus 1,800 contract people and 500 consultants. And as business manager, I handled all the business part of it, and we did a lot of work, $500 million a year of contracts in the area and so forth. And Going from there to that and seeing what was going on in the valley and so forth, I just had a different kind of feeling about what we were now versus then. In fact, one of what I was going to get to, I just remembered, is in some of our personnel management, they said, when you manage employees, you got to realize where they came from. And they had a program called You Are Now What You Were Then. You are now what you were then. If you grow up in this environment that I grew up in, you are much more totally independent person, having to work with others all the time to get things through versus the society that we have there. And if you manage people, you got to understand it. I mean, I'm kind of that way. I mean, I'm like, hey, we do things for people they ought to be doing for themselves. I mean, I can't believe some of the stuff that we did, but I've got to go back to how I grew up and what I grew up in at that point.
Right.
And I'm getting to be fewer and fewer at my age that are around to remember that.
Right.
And so we're into a different society. I'm not sure that's really a good society, because I think Kennedy said a great thing. He said, not ask what your country will do for you, you ask what can you do for your country. Remember, that was a great saying. Well, I think we've lost that mentality. Yeah. Somehow. So anyway, then Pleasanton grew from this little town, lower middle class agricultural town, to what it is now. So in those years, from the 50s on through the 60s, I worked on the 1968 general plan and spent about a year of my life on that. That was a lot of work. And we set up what we wanted Pleasanton to be like at that point.
And it was still very small at that point.
It was small, but then the biggies came in.
Yeah.
Prudential came in to build Hacienda Park and so forth. And Stonison came in to build the mall that he had. And that changed things dramatically from this little town here. Now, I was on a planning commission at that time when the growth came in. There were times when we had as many as 3,000 units that were up for approval. We didn't approve them all at the same time, but we're looking at them. So Morrison was in here building, and Massoud Moran was building in Livermore, Sunset Homes there, and Morrison was building Pleasanton Valley. And some of this mentality was still alive there. When they came in, they said, there's going to be this growth and we need housing, but we're going to have affordable housing. So when Morrison came in and he had his applications, we negotiated so that the lower priced home was like $17,500, and the most expensive one was $24,000, yeah, $17,500 to about $24,000. That was a Monterey model, was a big one, and I lived in the small one, which was the Raven. And everybody could afford a home. The home that I bought, the first home here, when I got married, was $20,000. And I could afford it. It was $125 a month. The first job I had was $500 a month. So
it was still quite a bit of your monthly paycheck went to housing.
Well, the FHA wanted
about a quarter.
A quarter. So yeah. If I earned $500 a month, I could afford $125 a month, and I could do that.
Yeah.
Now that home now, it's been remodeled and remodeled, but it's over $2 million. So they're building at $1,800 a square foot. And now, some of those homes are $1,000 a square foot. That's a huge difference. Yeah. Now, when we laid out the general plan, we expected kind of the general public buying into like you had in most of the areas here in town. Pleasanton, or what was it called,
Birdland.
Birdland, which was one of the biggest ones there. Then we had mobile home parks because some people couldn't afford even that, but the mobile home park was good. And then we had a lot of apartment houses and so forth. And so the housing element was fine for the people that lived in there. And then things changed when Prudential came in. Hacienda Park, which was at the time was being built, was the biggest a light industry, no smokestack kind of community in the state of California. It was big at that time. So it was the home office of Hewlett-Packard, Safeway, Clorox, PeopleSoft was here and so forth. So those are the executives. Now things changed. And so people wanted more expensive, bigger houses. Ruby Hills was what came in under Garamendi, wanted to develop it, and the question was, where was it going to be built? They wanted to have Ruby Hills be in Pleasanton.
Yes.
But where were they going to build it? Right next to Livermore. So the big discussion here is Ruby Hills did not want to have a Livermore zip code. It had to be Pleasanton. So we had to annex from our area, 14 miles or something like that. And the state said, you better do that because otherwise, or the county, we're going to build ourselves. So we had all this negotiation. And now you had all these people. It's huge. You've driven through that, did nothing but one mansion after the next. So pretty soon, it was very difficult to build just simple homes that everybody could support. People didn't want high density, so they got petitions up about high density areas and so forth. And we changed from a community where everybody could afford to live into a community where a lot of the people that serve the community cannot live in.
Yeah. And that's very unfortunate. Yeah.
And that's one of the big one of the big issues that we've got. Nonetheless, we've come very far from being a lower middle class community. It wasn't a couple of years ago they announced that Pleasanton income per capita for communities of 80,000 or above, that number one was Pleasanton. And that was per capita, and per household, I think it was San Ramon. I mean, we came from there to there.
Yeah.
So it's good, and it has its negative part.
What else do you see today that you really like in Pleasanton, or that you would like changed? Are there any?
In Pleasanton itself, I think it's, compared to a lot of communities, it's done really well. We have a very diverse community now. I mean,
Yes.
Between Asians and East Indians and all different kinds of cultures, and still we operate as a pretty good community, not involved as much crime as outside of our area. And I think crime is starting to get to be the single biggest thing now we're going to have to deal with, and nobody wants to deal with it, but they're going to have to. And we've got a beautiful downtown. The way that came about is an interesting way. It was not easy to open up that downtown area and allow restaurants to be on the sidewalk and all the rest of that. So, I mean,
Well, and you also got rid of a lot of the gas stations, a lot of the bars, some of the older businesses downtown that at one point, correct?
Yes. But I was on the committee to review the general plan, and I was head of the committee for the commercial part of it. And what we sent out, which was interesting, a survey, a very involved survey to fill out to every household in Pleasanton. This was in '68. What do you want Pleasanton to be like? I mean, just tell us, what do you want? And it had a lot to fill out. We hired some experts on this. And that all this information came in, and the expert was saying, I've never seen a response like this in my life. So we used one of the schools to collect all of this. I mean, I remember seeing tables and tables of it because all people responded, and there was a lot to look through.
Yeah.
And we put it in categories. What do you want in the city of Pleasanton? And what people wanted is a community that had a heart to it, the downtown area, and not have a lot of small malls all over the place that drew away from it, and they wanted that. They wanted to maintain the vineyard kind of thing, the agricultural kind of side. They didn't want it, they wanted the community to look good from the inside and the outside, in the sense of having some kind of a central theme. And our central theme for the architects was early California, and not have a smorgasbord of stuff in here to make things look bad and so forth. They wanted to have a very good transportation system in where we can go around the community and not have to go through it all the time. We wanted to have our commercial areas out near where the cross sections of the big 580 and 680 crossed, and put it in that area there. And it took us a long time, months, to pull all this together, to put up the general plan and to stay within that general plan. I can remember for my presentation, I went down to East 14th Street in Oakland, and I would step out when I could in the traffic and not get run over, and take a shot of looking at East 14th and seeing all of these ugly signs that were out there, buildings that leapfrog kind of approvals in which that one didn't match the other, they didn't blend in together. And I put a whole thing together and saying, do you want Pleasanton to look like this, or what would you like it to look like? And they said, you know, we don't want, we're going to have a big sign ordinance. We're not going to have it all look really ugly. We're going to have a nice entrance coming into Pleasanton from either side. You're coming down trees and so forth and all the rest of the stuff. It was a lot of work, and I think Pleasanton has stuck with that for the most part, and I like that about the community. Dublin is totally different. I mean, you know,
And even San Ramon, they don't have that pull that Pleasanton does, or Livermore does, with the downtown area, the gathering area.
Right, yeah. And so I like that about Pleasanton, and I think they've really fought to try to do that. What scares me is that we've lost some of our zoning controls and so forth, because the state is now starting to mandate and go over our zoning and being able to do things. And I think that, you know, one of the big things we didn't want to have anything more than about 4 stories in Pleasanton. And when Stoniston came to us the first time, and he had anchor tenants, he had Sears, he had, let's see, who he had? Pennies, he had Macy's, and all those really big. But in the middle of it, he had a 600-unit apartment house.
In the middle of the mall?
In the middle of the mall.
Oh.
So we went to a presentation which he had a model of what all this looked like. And I remember the commission and the council went there, and they said, well, what is that? And he says, oh, that's for the kids. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, when I build one of these things, I get, you know, for my grandchildren and so forth. I said, get the big 4-star. We don't want that. And he said, well, that goes with the whole thing. And then they kind of said, you're a bunch of yokels. You don't realize what we're offering you. And we said, well, we're not that bad on yokels. We don't want that there. So he said, well, screw you on the horse road. I'm pulling out.
Oh,
So we talked about it. Some people thought, well, maybe, I said, and all of us said, no, let's hang on to what we want. Everybody's coming into this area. We knew that the Prudential and everybody's coming in here. Once we reached, I think it was 350,000 population in the whole area, it qualifies for these big organizations to come in and put what they want. Well, it was growing, saying, we'll just wait, they'll do what we want. And he came back, he took that out, and we got what we wanted. And the same thing with Hacienda, it was all clean, it's a real clean industry and so forth, not to pollute the valley. And so we hung in there
yeah.
to get what we wanted. So I think Pleasanton has done pretty good in that compared to some other communities that gave into just huge developments that are kind of ugly now, and they've got a lot of problems. What the rest of the state is doing, we just don't know. People starting to control our communities, and I don't know where that's going to lead to.
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for it? I worry about the finances associated with it. The economic abilities are there. We supposedly had a $20 billion surplus not too long ago. Now we got a deficit.
Yeah, just last year we had a surplus.
So we have a $40 billion swing.
Yeah.
And who's going to pay for all that? But anyway, I lived in LA. I went to work for Cal West Life in Sacramento, then I moved to LA, and so I've been around, and I've come back here. This is my home, So I had all these various jobs, and the interesting thing about San Jose State at that time was a college mostly for a teaching college, and it had a very nice small campus and so forth. But everybody coming back from the war, and especially when Korea came and so forth, it just blossomed out, and it just was not capable of handling all that. So they had all kinds of different type of housing and everything in there. Military housing came on board the buildings and so forth to go to the classrooms and so forth. And they had it was, if you were a veteran, you could get $120 a month to go to college. And that wasn't very much. So everybody had to work. So you had a school full of people that were trying to go to college that were just struggling financially, and they had all kinds of different kinds of jobs. So it wasn't like going to Harvard or one of those kind of schools and so forth. But I got a good education as far as I was concerned.
Were your parents excited about you going to college?
Yes, right. And they helped out a lot. I mean, it was very important for them, and it was important for me. And the rest of the family had a little bit more of a struggle to do, and it wasn't that much pressure. But my dad, my dad had to quit school at from the third grade, and he couldn't finish his education.
Oh.
So he had to help support the family. And so it was important to him and important to me. So, I'd get just whatever kind of job that came along to do that. And so I did. And after I got a couple of jobs, I ended up coming to the lab.
Okay. Did you live at the college?
No, I drove, yes, I lived at the college and came home because I had a job on the weekends here
Okay.
and so forth. But I lived in 14 different places when I went to
To
school.
school, oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
and I know that because I had to fill out for security purposes at the laboratory because I had got top secret. And they went to every place that I had listed at work. And some of them were very difficult places to even find. And, I lived wherever I could live.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's essentially what it was. But then I would come home and I worked for the Housing Authority here in Pleasanton. I had a job there. And I was a sheet metal apprentice. And sometimes I had two jobs and so forth. And it's just
And most of the other students were also working?
yes. Yeah, like Phil Henry worked at Kaiser,
Yeah.
where his dad was, and he had a job there to help support himself and so forth. Almost everybody was in the same. We didn't have an economy here that supported people going to Harvard or Stanford
Yeah.
or anything like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's
Now, were you an only child? I haven't heard you talk about siblings.
yes. I was an only child, and from a statistical standpoint, I believe probably during the Depression and those war years, that was probably the lowest birth rate in the history of this country. And in fact, my dad's brothers and sisters, some of them had only one child only, and some of them had no children.
Okay.
And my grandmother had 9 brothers and sisters, and my dad had 7 brothers and sisters. And out of that, there were several had no children, several of them had only one child.
So it was, yeah, it really dropped off drastically.
It really dropped off drastically.
Yeah.
They also, in Europe, primogeniture was the firstborn male inherits everything. That was another thing that I failed to mention is about why all these people immigrated. And my grandfather's family, there were 14 children. 4 of them died early. They had these huge families to help support them. But the problem is when it came to turning
Especially if they were farmers,
they were all
agriculture.
farmers.
Yeah.
There were vintners. A lot of them in the family were vintners.
Okay.
And in fact, I had one uncle that made the Pons winery was yeah, and he made the champagne and he made the sweet vermouth and the cream sherry for him, and then they put the labels of Pons
Their labels, yeah.
And so because in both Italy and France there was a lot of vineyards in the countries that they came from, but you had all these people working in these families, men and women. Women were put out for working as service, and the males had to find other jobs, and they were very difficult at that time. So as far as inheritance came, if you weren't the firstborn male, then you came here.
You were out of luck, yeah.
And almost all of them, that was one of the reasons. Of course, it was an economic thing, but
Right.
it also was a part of inheritance.
Well, there wasn't birth control, so to speak, in the days during the Depression. So how did people not have children or have very few children?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm sure that there wasn't a pill, that
Yeah.
was for sure. Abstinence was, a part of it. And of course, there are other type of mechanisms. The church did not view this well, the fact that people were practicing birth control and so forth.
And
And
now when you talk about the church, you're talking about the Catholic Church
a Catholic church
Okay.
predominantly. We were all Catholic.
Okay.
I mean, you know,
from Italy and, yeah,
yes, right, from
Yeah.
our background. And if you went to confession and you confessed on using some kind of birth control practices, you were usually had to say an extra Hail Our Fathers and, and Hail Marys and so forth. But nonetheless, people did not have and couldn't afford large families like they did in Europe. And so when I look at the families, our family, from my grandmother and grandfather, and then all the brothers and sisters of my family, it's huge. But the number of people that are now survived all that is very small. They're probably 1/10
yeah,
of the numbers.
yeah,
Children were a burden,
yeah.
and
And maybe the fear of what was happening with the world.
and
Do you
then
think
there was,
that?
then there was the issue about the unknown,
Yeah.
certainly, you know. But yeah, they're just the birth rate just pretty well
Dropped
shut
off.
down. And so forth. Having a big family to support yourself in the end was just not in the planning of life here. So,
Yeah,
I think also people knew that there was a lot of opportunity here, and you didn't have to have 10 children to support you on a farm in order to survive here.
oh, okay,
So, there was just other opportunities.
okay.
And I think that probably
That
had
made
to-
a difference
had
as
to
well.
do with it and so forth.
So is there any, we've talked some about Pleasanton and how it's grown, and you've said that you like some of the things that we've done as far as the downtown and the general plan and such, but you're concerned about the state now maybe taking over some of our zoning, as an issue. Is there anything else that you are concerned about for Pleasanton at this time that you would change if you could?
I'm pretty happy with Pleasanton the way it is. I'm concerned about the outside interference to make it a community that's other than what it can really support as being a good community. I don't know what the answer is. I think we made a mistake a little while back about not looking at affordability for a hunk of the population that couldn't afford to live here, but works here and supports the community and so forth.
Right.
I think we might have made a mistake of letting more of an elitist kind of mentality float in here, and we should have probably done a better job. I know the first time that we put in a mobile home park, we have two of them here. That went pretty good, but when it was talking about expanding that at all, that was kind of looked down upon. And yet, right now, it's a very important source for people to live in now. They're remodeling those. Those places are really actually pretty nice here in Pleasanton and so forth.
But we only have for seniors. We don't have a family park.
Yeah. And so, and that's an issue for seniors. I mean, as more of us get older and so forth and move into that category, probably residence for seniors and as the population gets older and older, that's going to be a huge issue because the cost is unbelievable.
Yeah, because the single-story houses are perfect for seniors, but yet economically, it's much more efficient for people to build, you know, 3, 4-story places and put people in those instead of the little bungalows that we've had built around town before.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. The cost of building is, I think it costs $134,000 or something like that to put utilities into houses being built. That's very high. Cost of land, cost of buying a lot in Pleasanton. So I get, of course, one of the issues is that we didn't allow prefabbed housing in here for a long time. Now we're looking at it with these ADUs and so forth, and we're going to have to do a lot more of that. We're going to have to allow more prefabricated housing in here one way or the other. I mean, we can't afford to look at when we built back in the 50s at $18 a square foot, and now to own something, a place in Pleasanton, so it can be $1,000 a square foot.
Yeah.
When you work the formula out on that, it's way out of line.
Yeah.
But everything is. I guess the single biggest thing I see from, say, working at the lab is the loss of the middle class. That's the single biggest thing. When I started working at the lab, I was a buyer of items and so forth. That's how I started out. Then I went into contract management and all the rest of that. And we bought a lot in the valley. We did $50 million worth of business at the lab. Not all of it in the valley here, obviously, but we did a lot. And there was a lot of businesses. I used to go around and visit in the Bay Area and so forth. It was full of tool and die machines, shops, injection molding operations, lathe and milling operations, forging and so forth, this big middle class. Then we started contracting out to China. And so in the 30 years I worked for the lab, at the beginning we contracted a lot right out in the Bay Area. When I left, they were all gone. And those people provided the middle class that spent money here, earned well, had a good standard of living, and was balanced in its political attitudes. We as a nation have lost all of that.
Yeah.
And that, I think, to me, is one of the biggest problems we have. We're trying to bring it back, but it isn't that easy. And we had the Buy American Act. At that time, we had to buy in the United States manufactured before we could go and get it elsewhere. But that just kind of fell by the wayside as far as I'm concerned. And we lost this big middle class that had a lot more common sense about how to manage it.
Yeah, and then we've got such astronomical salaries that we pay athletes that, is just really crazy.
Right.
A lot of money, and then we have, it's really.
It has really changed itself. In 71, I think that a CEO of a corporation, made something like 30 times the average salary of the workers, of the regular workers. It's almost 300 times that. I was just reading Wall Street Journal about the number of CEOs that make over $100 million a year. $100 million.
And
I mean, that's way out of line versus what the people are making now.
Yeah.
I'm told that the like the Wall family and some of these big trusts, the net worth is more than, well, 50% of the people in this country have no net worth. They have paying rent. They've got huge costs of living, housing and so forth, and they're barely making it. And yet we have some people that probably have net worth that's more than 50% of what the people have in the United States right now. That's way out of line. That's huge out of line. And that causes all kinds of problems. The attitude towards people of wealth it's getting very negative. And yet, when you look at California, 1% of the population pays 40% of the taxes. That's pretty dangerous because those people are moving out of state. 5% of the population pays 60% of all the taxes. I mean, we're dependent on just a very small number of people to keep this entire state going. And so we, and then we have a lot of immigration now, and we have people that essentially need to be supported rather than providing, the economic resources to keep the state going. I don't know what you do about that. I think that's I see that as one of the biggest problems that we have in the United States is the unequal division of wealth is going to be a big. I mean, you've got Bezos, who's Amazon, has got a yacht bigger than a cruise ship. And people that owned, $100 million houses and so forth.
And then the power that they get because they do have the money.
Yeah, you can, if you want to run for president, you can actually bankroll your entire, candidacy. Somehow, this middle class and the moderate, either Republican or Democratic contingent is just not there anymore. And we're kind of a divided country, probably more than now than ever. And I don't know how you get all that back into working properly again, because we need that. We're a great country, and look at what we came from, and we came from nothing. I mean, the people that made up this state, this country.
Many were poor when they came.
Poor, And also, we're not, the way that we're looking at history, or no history at all, we don't look at our real history, to understand how it all really happened. People don't realize how many sacrifices that occurred when we first had our own revolution. And, we went into a museum in England, and it was, when I call a museum, it was, a place you visit. It was the prison that the British had in London of those that got engaged in the revolution in this country that were considered traitors, and they were brought to England and put in prison. And then there were others here that bankroll, we didn't have an army, we actually, private citizens bankrolled the army and made provide them with guns and everything they needed. It was all private. The number of them that were killed during the war was astronomical. Almost 50% suffered one way or the other, lost everything they had to bankroll it. This private army and overthrew one of the greatest, most powerful nations in the world. And to get where we are. And now we don't have that kind of dedication that would do something like that. You know, I mean, it's
Since World War II, we don't have that, we didn't have that same camaraderie in Korea or Vietnam.
right. So, and we've kind of distorted history, or not provided a real vision to what it was. We don't teach that anymore. And it was surprising to see this prison in London, and thinking like, yeah, I think about this. Every person that got into the revolution was really a traitor to England and suffered by it. They were,
and their families could suffer.
Yeah,
as well as
and actually Washington. If you go into some of the museums in Washington, you see Washington's family. He was essentially the biggest traitor of them all, because he was he was royalty and the upper class and all the rest of that, and yet, you know, he rebelled and formed this ragtag army, and I mean, and this is how we got to be where we are. You know, we are. It was the first really big rebellion against the aristocrats, you know, and then you had the falling of the Bastille, and then pretty soon all the revolutions to get to where we are, to have this democratic freedom society we have. We don't understand that very well.
Yeah, we don't.
And, you know, so anyway, having lived some 88 years, and seeing this community grow, and all the great things that happen here, my concern is that we keep this going, that we do the right things so that everybody enjoys what we have. And I think that's the most important thing of all. How do we get everybody on the same track of understanding what we are and what we want to do?
Okay.
That's all I know.
Well, thank you very much. I